Ancient debt was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a legal technology for turning hunger into obedience. Today, we open 8 case files on the ancient machinery of debt bondage, from Sumerian reform cones to Roman statutes that gave arithmetic a body count. The first 7 files dismantle the clean textbook story that law slowly rescued humanity from coercion. But the final file, a legally free farmer pinned to an estate by tax records, forces a colder question. What if civilization did not abolish the chain, but simply improved the paperwork? Chapter 1. The first word for freedom was a debt receipt. Case file number 1. You stand in southern Mesopotamia in the hot administrative dust of Lagash, where a widow waits outside a temple office and a scribe presses wet clay into the shape of someone else's survival. The city is not collapsing from invasion. No foreign army is burning the granaries. The danger is quieter. Officials have discovered that power becomes more durable when it is written down, sealed, and renamed as obligation. Somewhere inside this machinery stands Urukagina, ruler of Lagash and Girsu, a king whose reform inscriptions do not read like poetry. They read like damage control. If this anomaly is verified, the comforting timeline of law as moral progress has to be rewritten from scratch, because one of civilization's earliest political emergencies was not crime in the streets. It was respectable extraction by men with titles. The object in the file is not a golden mask or a heroic statue. It is clay. Cones, fragments, administrative remains, the usual glamorous paperwork of a world that accidentally preserved its nervous system in mud. Urukagina's reforms are usually placed in the 24th century BCE in early dynastic Sumer. The inscriptions are linked to Lagash and Girsu, and objects associated with this reform tradition survive in collections including the Louvre. They speak of canceling obligations, restraining officials, and protecting the orphan and the widow from the powerful. One term often dragged into this discussion is the Sumerian amagi, or amargi, frequently connected with early language for liberty, release, or return to the mother. The exact legal scope remains debated, which is convenient for everyone who likes certainty and inconvenient for everyone reading the clay. The physical contradiction is blunt. The earliest known vocabulary of freedom does not appear as a glowing philosophical manifesto about universal dignity. It appears in the neighborhood of debt release, tax abuse, official seizure, and the desperate effort to stop obligation from becoming ownership. Freedom enters the archive like an accounting correction. This is where the textbook narrative begins to cough. We are usually told that early states invented law to create order. That is not wrong. It is just incomplete in the way a locked door is incomplete without mentioning who has the key. In Lagash, law was not merely the opposite of violence. Law was also the system that allowed violence to become legible, repeatable, and polite. A man with a club can steal your goat once. A man with an office can turn your goat, field, labor, sons, daughters, and future harvest into a structured revenue stream. Progress. The engineering challenge here was not mechanical. It was institutional. A Bronze Age city-state had already built enough administrative complexity to measure grain, assign duties, record obligations, certify claims, and allow public officials to behave like private predators. That requires scribes, seals, storage systems, courts, temples, palace authority, and a social order trained to believe that clay tablets have consequences. They did. Urukagina's intervention suggests that the system had become too efficient. Temple bureaucracy, palace administration, and hereditary local elites had converted public office into private extraction. The widow was not just vulnerable because she was poor. She was vulnerable because the system could calculate her vulnerability. The orphan was not merely unprotected, he was available. Who feared reform? Not the hungry. Not the indebted. Not the small producers watching their surplus disappear before it had finished becoming food. The threatened class was the alliance of officials and local elites who had learned that debt was better than conquest. Conquest requires soldiers. Debt requires forms. It captures labor without calling it capture. It transfers land without calling it theft. It turns dependency into procedure. Urukagina was not running a charity. He was defending legitimacy. A city-state in which too many households are swallowed by officials stops being a stable society and becomes a slow-motion inventory liquidation. Apparently, when enough ordinary people are crushed, the state begins to lose the very population it planned to tax. This discovery has been made repeatedly for 5,000 years, with the shocked innocence of someone touching the same hot stove in different languages. The erasure is easy to understand. Later history prefers kings as builders, canal builders, temple builders, city builders, bronze-faced men standing heroically over conquered enemies. It is less comfortable to remember a king as an emergency auditor cleaning up elite predation with a clay cone and a legal migraine. That image lacks majesty. It has receipts. The orthodox explanation remains tidy. Urukagina was a reforming ruler. His inscriptions advertised royal justice. The king protected the weak because ancient kings liked presenting themselves as guardians of order. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the math completely breaks down. Because if this was only royal propaganda, why does the propaganda point so specifically toward debt, official abuse, seizure, widows, orphans, obligations, and release? If the goal was merely to look noble, the king could have claimed he fed the poor, pleased the gods, widened canals, defeated enemies, and made the sun behave more responsibly. Instead, the archive circles around extraction, around claims, around the frightening possibility that the state's own operators had become parasites on the body they were supposed to administer. Sure, pure moral enlightenment. Very adorable. A more cautious reading is colder. Urukagina may have been using reform language to break rival elite networks and recentralize authority under the palace. He may have been responding to a real social crisis that threatened agricultural production and military manpower. Or the reforms may represent a political performance whose value lies precisely in what it had to pretend to fix. Even propaganda has fingerprints. Lies usually choose their subject matter carefully. The most unsettling hypothesis is that early rulers understood something modern systems often bury under terminology. Debt is never just economic. Debt decides who can marry, who can keep land, who can eat seed grain instead of planting it, who must surrender labor, who can resist officials, and who must lower his voice in public. Debt is governance by arithmetic. So what did freedom mean before philosophers polished it into an abstraction? Was liberty first imagined not as the right to speak, but as the removal of a claim from someone's body and field? And if the earliest recorded freedom was a release from obligation, what does that say about every later civilization that calls permanent indebtedness normal? The takeaway is not that Urukagina was a saint. Saints rarely leave behind administrative reform programs. The takeaway is harsher. Human societies can identify predation very early, especially when predation threatens the state itself. The poor may experience debt as hunger. The ruler experiences it as declining capacity. Both are real. Only one usually gets an inscription. Clay preserves what marble tries to improve. And from this clay world of reform cones and official seizures, the trail moves deeper into the arithmetic of survival, where the loan is not yet a chain. But the interest is already measuring the wrist. Chapter 2. The interest rate that ate the harvest. The second entry in the archive begins before sunrise, with you standing at the edge of a barley field that has not yet decided whether it will feed a family or ruin one. The soil is dry enough to worry about. The seed grain is low. Inside the house, children are still asleep, which is useful, because hunger is easier to negotiate with when it is quiet. Across from you sits the creditor. He does not need to look cruel. Cruelty is inefficient when the tablet can do the work. A scribe prepares the clay. A seal waits. A few witnesses make the transaction respectable. The farmer borrows grain because the alternative is immediate failure. The creditor lends grain because delayed failure is more profitable. If this anomaly is verified, the timeline of early civilization as a heroic surplus machine needs to be corrected. The harvest was not merely grown, it was pre-owned. The file takes us to Mesopotamia during the Ur-3 period, conventionally dated around 2112 to 2004 BCE. The evidence is administrative, which means it is boring in the most dangerous way possible. Loans were written on clay tablets, sealed by parties or authorities, witnessed, quantified, dated, and tied to repayment terms. Standard rates are widely identified as 33 1/3% for barley loans and 20% for silver loans. The material is not symbolic, it is granular. Grain, silver, fields, labor, repayment schedules, family pledges. Civilization with columns. The contradiction is mathematical. A farmer borrows barley before harvest because he lacks enough food, seed, or liquidity to survive the season. The contract then demands repayment from the same uncertain harvest that made borrowing necessary. At 33 1/3%, a loan of 300 liters becomes 400 liters. A loan of 600 liters becomes 800. Weather is not consulted. Locusts are not invited to renegotiate. Illness does not receive a procedural extension. The tablet remains calm. The official story says agriculture produced surplus, surplus produced cities, and cities produced law. Clean, elegant, museum safe. But the tablets show a less decorative system. Surplus could be claimed before it existed. A crop still underground could already have an owner waiting above it. This is not primitive confusion. It is sophisticated risk transfer. The farmer carries the biological uncertainty of the field. The creditor carries a legal claim. One man negotiates with rain, the other negotiates with documentation. Guess which one usually wins? The engineering was not in the plow alone. It was in the social machinery around the plow. For a barley loan to become enforceable, the society required measurement standards, scribal literacy, seals, witnesses, archives, courts, institutional memory, and a shared fear of what happens when your name is on clay. That is not a loose village economy. That is an administrative trap with agricultural scenery. And because grain was life, barley credit was never just credit. It was seed, bread, tax payment, ritual contribution, rent, and survival compressed into a commodity that could be measured, borrowed, and multiplied by interest. Once the harvest failed, the lender did not merely lose patience. He gained options. Family members could be pledged. Labor could be claimed. Land rights could shift. The loan began as food assistance and matured into human leverage. A beautiful product, terrible customer experience. Who benefited from this system? Not the man waiting for the rain. Creditors were often embedded in temple, palace, and merchant networks. These were not random neighborhood villains operating from a shed labeled predatory finance. They were linked to institutions that already controlled storage, records, taxation, and exchange. Debt allowed those institutions to move risk downward. Drought became the farmer's problem. Tax pressure became the farmer's problem. Hunger became the farmer's problem. Interest became civilization. That is the hidden political layer. Debt does not merely enrich creditors. It disciplines populations. A household that owes grain is less likely to resist officials. A man who has pledged labor thinks carefully before speaking loudly. A family whose children can become collateral has discovered the outer limit of political theory. The system feared one thing above all: interruption. A bad harvest could be survivable if losses were shared. But when contracts converted uncertainty into fixed repayment, the crisis moved downward and stayed there. The temple still needed grain. The palace still needed tax. The creditor still needed return. The farmer, with touching optimism, still needed to exist. The erasure is easy because debt bondage rarely announces itself as bondage at the beginning. It enters dressed as help. A loan looks humane compared with starvation. The tablet looks neutral compared with theft. The seal looks civilized compared with a spear. By the time the trap closes, everyone can insist that procedure was followed. The orthodox explanation says ancient credit helped farmers participate in a developing economy. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the math completely breaks down. Yes, the farmer participated. In the same way a bird participates in architecture by living inside a cage. A system that lends you seed at 1/3 interest because you are desperate, then accepts your labor or children when the sky misbehaves, is not simply financial inclusion. It is grain-flavored hostage negotiation. Still, the orthodox view is not useless. Credit did solve real seasonal problems. Farmers genuinely needed seed and food before harvest. Temples and palaces genuinely needed predictable flows of goods. Merchants genuinely took risks. The issue is not that lending existed. The issue is that the risk was not symmetrical. When the creditor won, he gained interest. When the farmer lost, he could lose the future tense. Several cautious hypotheses can sit on the table without pretending to be certainties. The first is that high barley interest compensated lenders for agricultural risk. But because enforcement was social and bodily, the compensation became a mechanism of control. The second is that institutional creditors used standardized rates to stabilize accounting across large economies, then quietly accepted the human damage as an administrative side effect. Very tidy. The third is that debt cycles were not accidental failures of early civilization, but recurring features of states that needed grain faster than fields could safely produce it. The math does not work because the math was never alone. It was backed by courts, seals, storage, hierarchy, and the desperate silence of people who had to borrow in order to survive. So when does assistance become capture? If a contract is legal, but survival leaves one party no real choice, is the seal evidence of consent or merely a better-looking chain? And what kind of civilization calls a harvest surplus when the crop has already been eaten by interest before it reaches the floor? The lesson is cold. Human beings did not wait for modern banking to discover the power of compounding pressure. They found it in barley. They pressed it into clay. Then they called it order. And once order learned to collect from hunger, the next question became unavoidable. How much bondage could a state permit before the bodies of its debtors disappeared into creditor households completely? Babylon answered with a law code, a timer, and the confidence of a society that believed 3 years of family servitude was moderation. Chapter 3. Hammurabi's 3-year mercy clause. Our third stop breaks the timeline in Babylon, where you stand before a black stone monument polished into authority and carved with the confidence of a state that knows exactly how much suffering can be standardized. Above, the king receives the symbols of rule. Below, law becomes text. Somewhere beyond the monument, a debtor has failed to meet a claim, and his household is beginning to turn into collateral. He may be a farmer. He may be a small producer. He may be a man caught between taxes, harvest, and the arithmetic of someone with better storage. His wife stands beside him. His son is old enough to work. His daughter is old enough to be useful to another household. The creditor does not need to improvise. Babylon has rules for this. If this anomaly is verified, the famous story of law as the clean replacement for brutality needs a colder footnote. One of the world's most celebrated law codes did not abolish debt bondage. It scheduled it. The object is the Code of Hammurabi, commonly dated to around 1750 BCE. It contains 282 laws. Among them, Law 117 states that if a man cannot satisfy a debt claim and gives himself, his wife, his son, or his daughter into service, they work in the creditor's household for 3 years and are released in the 4th. Related provisions regulate creditor behavior, pledged persons, and debt enforcement. The numbers matter. 1 law code, 282 provisions, 1 failed debt, up to 4 family members, 3 years of service, release in the 4th. A tidy arrangement. Almost tender, if one ignores the part where a household becomes a repayment schedule. The contradiction is not that Babylon was lawless, it is the opposite. Babylon was legally sophisticated enough to make bondage administratively neat. The debtor's body was not seized by chaos, his family was absorbed through procedure. The state did not look away from debt servitude. It looked directly at it, measured it, limited it, and preserved it. This is where civilization becomes very proud of its restraint. The engineering problem Hammurabi faced was not how to invent cruelty. Cruelty was already available, usually at low cost. The challenge was how to let creditors collect without destroying the free households that fed the kingdom, served in labor obligations, produced tax revenue, and made imperial ambition less imaginary. Too much creditor power, and the population sinks into dependency. Too little creditor protection, and the lending system begins to distrust the throne. Hammurabi's solution was a compromise with handcuffs. 3 years. That number matters because it reveals the mind of the state. Permanent enslavement for debt could strip households from the tax base. Immediate cancellation could anger creditors. So the law carved out a middle path. Temporary household bondage. Not abolition, not freedom. Containment. A pressure valve for a society that knew debt could become politically explosive if allowed to run without limits. The textbook version presents Hammurabi's Code as a milestone of justice. And that is not entirely false. Written law can restrain arbitrary power. Publicly known penalties can reduce private revenge. Standardized rules can make society less dependent on the mood of whichever powerful man woke up irritated that morning. Compared with pure predation, codified predation is at least predictable. A bleak improvement, but still an improvement. The official story is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the math completely breaks down, because the law does not ask why the debt became unpayable. Was the harvest poor? Were taxes excessive? Did illness strike? Did a creditor exploit desperation? The code does not pause for a social investigation. It defines the acceptable human cost of default. Wife, son, daughter, self. 3 years, 4th year release. Babylonian moderation, with family members included. Very civilized. The brochure writes itself. The deeper political layer is a state balancing 2 fears. The first fear was creditor revolt. Creditors mattered. They supplied liquidity, supported exchange, and often sat near the institutions that made administration possible. A king who casually destroyed creditor claims risked alienating the people whose records, resources, and networks helped the kingdom function. The second fear was debtor collapse. If too many free households disappeared into creditor dependency, the palace would lose workers, soldiers, taxpayers, and social peace. Hammurabi's mercy clause sits exactly between those fears. It protects the creditor's right to collect. It protects the debtor's household from permanent disappearance. It protects the state most of all. That is the part usually softened in textbooks. The code was not a glowing humanitarian document delivered from the heavens because lawgivers had discovered compassion. It was political engineering. A kingdom is not a moral philosophy seminar. It is a machine that needs grain, labor, obedience, and enough legitimacy to prevent everyone from testing the walls at once. Debt threatened that machine because it transferred people away from royal usefulness into private control. A creditor who gained a debtor's labor gained more than repayment. He gained power over a household. Multiply that across villages, fields, and harvest cycles, and private claims begin competing with public authority. Debt bondage was not merely an economic practice. It was a rival form of sovereignty, one contract at a time. The erasure happens through admiration. Hammurabi is easy to monumentalize. The stone is imposing. The laws are ancient. The format feels foundational. Humans love origins, especially when they can be carved onto something dramatic and displayed behind glass. But admiration can become anesthesia. We stare at the monument and forget the debtor standing underneath it, calculating which child can be spared for 3 years. The orthodox explanation deserves its hearing. A society without modern bankruptcy law needed mechanisms for default. Temporary service may have been an attempt to prevent permanent enslavement. In that sense, Law 117 did impose a real limit on creditor abuse. It recognized that debt servitude existed and placed a boundary around it. Fair. But the boundary also confirms the practice. A rule limiting family bondage is still a rule allowing family bondage. A timer on coercion does not make coercion disappear. It simply makes the calendar complicit. Alternative readings remain possible. Hammurabi may have been standardizing older customs to bring local practices under royal authority. He may have been advertising himself as the protector of vulnerable households while carefully refusing to break the creditor class. Or he may have been preserving the minimum freedom necessary for a taxable society to reproduce itself. The law could be mercy, propaganda, and fiscal management at the same time. Ancient states were not required to have only one motive. They were advanced enough to be hypocritical in layers. The unsettling point is that Hammurabi's code reveals a civilization already aware of debt's destructive potential. The state saw that default could swallow families. It saw that creditors could overreach. It saw that social order required limits. Then it chose a limit that still allowed the debtor's household to be temporarily consumed. So what should we call a legal system that protects a family by permitting only 3 years of its seizure? Is justice still justice when it works mainly by preventing the worst version of an accepted abuse? And if law can transform desperation into service with a clean clause and a release date, where exactly does violence end and administration begin? The takeaway is not that Babylon was uniquely cruel. That would be too easy and too flattering to everyone who came later. The takeaway is that legal sophistication does not automatically equal moral progress. Sometimes law civilizes exploitation by giving it grammar. Babylon gave debt bondage a timer. Later kings would go further, not because creditors became gentle, but because even temporary bondage could accumulate into a social crisis. When debt grew faster than the kingdom could absorb, the palace reached for a more dramatic instrument, the royal reset button. The edict creditors hated because it remembered something markets prefer to forget. Chapter 4. The royal reset button, creditors hated. The fourth folder opens with you standing in Babylon after the ledgers have become heavier than the fields. The streets are intact, the temples still rise. The palace still speaks in the language of order. But beneath the administrative calm, households have begun to vanish into claims. A farmer owes grain, a widow owes silver. A son has been pledged. A daughter is no longer sleeping under her own roof. At the center of the file stands Amisaduqa, a later king of Babylon and descendant of Hammurabi's dynasty, facing a problem every serious ruler eventually meets. What happens when private creditors become so successful that they start consuming the king's society? If this anomaly is verified, the modern assumption that debt cancellation is a soft, irresponsible fantasy collapses into a very old clay floor. Bronze Age monarchs were already using debt remission as state maintenance, not as utopia, as plumbing. The object is the Maishram Edict of Amisaduqa, one of the most complete surviving examples of Old Babylonian debt remission decrees. Amisaduqa ruled in the Old Babylonian period, and his edict canceled certain categories of debt, released people sold into debt slavery, and restored social balance by royal command. Debt remission traditions across the ancient Near East are attested across roughly 2,400 to 1,600 BCE. These edicts usually targeted personal agrarian debts, not every commercial obligation. The distinction matters. The king was not deleting trade. He was stopping subsistence society from being eaten alive. The numbers sit together like a warning label. Centuries of remission practice, royal accessions, agrarian debts, pledged persons, canceled arrears, released debt slaves, preserved tax base. The contradiction is brutal. The supposedly primitive monarchy sometimes understood a principle later societies decorate with anxiety. Debts can grow faster than real economies. The engineering here was political, not sentimental. A debt remission edict required a palace strong enough to override creditor claims, an administrative network capable of identifying obligations, scribes who could distinguish categories of debt, officials who could enforce release, and a public ideology in which the king had the right to restore order against private accumulation. That is not chaos. That is emergency macroeconomics with incense. Very ancient. Very radical. Very bad for certain respectable men. Amisaduka's problem was not that creditors existed. Credit was necessary. Grain had seasons. Silver moved unevenly. Households borrowed because fields do not produce on command. The danger emerged when private claims became structurally stronger than public survival. If enough farmers lost land, labor, or dependence, the palace lost soldiers, taxpayers, canal workers, and food producers. The creditor gained a household. The king lost a kingdom, one contract at a time. That is why debt cancellation could be royal self-defense disguised as mercy. A king who canceled agrarian debts was not necessarily hugging the poor in a sudden emotional breakthrough. He was interrupting a rival system of power. Private creditors had built small empires out of obligation. The palace answered with a larger empire called decree. The threatened class was obvious. Creditors who had accumulated claims over fields, grain, and bodies did not welcome a royal announcement that yesterday's profitable misery had become legally inconvenient. For them, the edict was not justice. It was confiscation with better music. Their position was simple. Contracts must be honored. The king's position was simpler. Contracts are lovely until they eat the tax base. This is where later historiography becomes suspiciously well-dressed. Debt forgiveness is often framed as moral weakness, political pandering, or the dangerous dream of people who dislike responsibility. The ancient record is less cooperative. Bronze Age kings were canceling debts before most later civilizations had finished inventing their favorite excuses for not doing it. Apparently, when every farmer is in bondage, the harvest does not become more responsible. It becomes unavailable. The orthodox explanation says these edicts were exceptional royal acts tied to accessions, jubilees, or social strain. They were not permanent economic policy. They did not abolish hierarchy, they did not free all slaves, they did not erase commercial debts across the entire economy. This is fair. It matters. The palace was not creating equality, it was resetting instability. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the math completely breaks down. Because if debt remission had to be repeated across centuries, then the problem was not a rare emergency, it was a structural feature. If each generation of rulers needed to release debtors, cancel obligations, and return families to productive life, then the system was not occasionally malfunctioning. It was performing normally. The crisis was built into the interest, the taxes, the harvest risk, and the legal enforceability of claims against vulnerable households. The reset button proves the machine had no self-correction. It needed a king with a hammer. One cautious hypothesis is that debt remissions were accession rituals designed to announce a new reign and bind subjects emotionally to the crown. Another is that they were practical interventions after war, famine, or economic strain when the palace needed to restore labor and loyalty. A third is that remission served as a weapon against private elites, cutting creditor networks down before they could rival royal authority. These explanations do not cancel each other. Ancient politics had room for hypocrisy, strategy, and genuine fear in the same sentence. The satire writes itself, unfortunately. Debt cancellation is irresponsible, says the modern voice, standing bravely against a policy older than large parts of the alphabet. Bronze Age rulers with no central bank, no economics department, and no panel of television experts nodding gravely still noticed that permanent insolvency is not a productivity strategy. Shocking. Silence. Then the clay says what polished ideology avoid. Debt is not sacred because it is written. Debt is a human arrangement. And when a human arrangement begins dissolving the society that supports it, rulers either break the arrangement or watch the arrangement break the state. Amisaduka's edict also exposes the limits of royal reform. The reset button could free a debtor, but it did not remove the conditions that produced debt. Fields still failed. Taxes still arrived. Creditors still lent. Families still hovered near the edge of obligation. The edict was a door opened in a burning room. Useful. Necessary. Not the same as rebuilding the house. So who owned justice in Babylon? The creditor with a valid claim, the debtor with a collapsing household, or the king who needed both alive enough to serve the realm? If a contract destroys the society that enforces it, is breaking the contract lawlessness or preservation? And why do later civilizations call ancient debt remission primitive while repeatedly rediscovering bankruptcy, amnesty, restructuring, and relief under more respectable names? The takeaway is severe. Debt cancellation was not the enemy of order. In these systems, it was sometimes the only thing preventing order from becoming a feeding mechanism for the powerful. The palace did not cancel debt because it hated property. It canceled debt because property claims had begun to devour people. From Babylon's royal reset, the trail moves west into a community that claimed divine law had already solved the problem. Release would be commanded. Brothers would not devour brothers. Land would return. Children would not become payment. Then famine arrived, taxes followed, lenders appeared, and the sacred text met the invoice. Chapter 5, Nehemiah and the Children. Mortgaged for tax. The fifth file opens in Jerusalem, where you stand among unfinished walls and finished debts. Stone is being lifted back into place. Gates are being repaired. A wounded community is trying to become a city again. It should be a scene of restoration, the kind that later sermons can polish until every edge disappears. Then the complaints begin. Families come forward not with abstract theology, but with fields, vineyards, houses, hunger, taxes, and children already slipping out of their reach. Some have mortgaged land to survive famine. Some have borrowed money to pay the king's tax. Some have sons and daughters being pulled into servitude, with daughters already enslaved. The wall may be rising, but inside the community, people are being dismantled piece by piece. At the center stands Nehemiah, Persian-appointed governor of Judah in the 5th century BCE, trying to rebuild Jerusalem while discovering that a community can be conquered from outside and still devour itself from within. If this anomaly is verified, then sacred law was not merely a spiritual ideal floating above ancient economics. It was an emergency brake installed because everyone already knew the machine could eat children. The file is Nehemiah 5. The data cluster is not subtle. The passage describes people borrowing money to pay royal tax on fields and vineyards. It names mortgaged fields, vineyards, and houses. It describes sons and daughters being subjected to slavery, with some daughters already enslaved. Deuteronomy 15 commands debt release at the end of every 7 years for fellow Israelites. Leviticus 25 describes Jubilee after 7 cycles of 7 years, the 50th year, involving return of property and liberation. Sacred calendar, land restoration, release from debt servitude, imperial tax pressure, famine, mortgage, child bondage, a complete system in one wound. The contradiction is merciless. The law said release. The economy said collateral. The empire said pay. The family stood in the middle, discovering that theology has excellent principles and creditors have deadlines. The engineering problem here was not that Judah lacked moral vocabulary. It had plenty. Covenant language, brotherly obligation, sabbatical release, jubilee memory. The society possessed a legal and religious imagination capable of seeing permanent debt bondage as lethal. That is precisely what makes the crisis sharper. This was not a world with no concept of release. It was a world where release existed, and still the poor were forced to mortgage their future because taxation and famine do not pause respectfully for ideals. This is where the official story of ancient religion as simple moral instruction becomes too soft. The debt release laws were not decorative ethics. They were survival architecture. They recognized that land was not just property. Land was memory, identity, food, inheritance, and the material basis of freedom. Once land moved upward into elite hands, the poor did not merely lose assets. They lost the ground on which social belonging stood. Children entered the system because debt always searches for the next available unit of value. First the grain, then the field, then the house, then the labor, then the child. A very spiritual sequence. Deeply uplifting. The political layer is a triangle. At the top sits the Persian imperial system demanding revenue. In the middle stand local nobles and officials with enough resources to lend. At the bottom are poor families turning land and bodies into payment instruments. This was not a private misunderstanding between one irresponsible borrower and one disciplined lender. It was empire, climate, class, and law converging on the household. The threatened authority was not only the poor man's freedom, it was communal covenant itself. The language of brotherhood became absurd when one brother could hold another brother's child as payment. At that point, the community had not merely failed economically. It had become the opposite of its own sacred grammar. Nehemiah's anger makes sense because the crisis was politically dangerous. He was trying to rebuild walls, restore civic order, and stabilize a fragile province under Persian oversight. A population crushed by internal creditor power was not useful for reconstruction. A community losing land and children to elite lenders was not a community preparing for strength. It was a ledger with prayers attached. Who feared reform? The nobles and officials whose lending power had become socially poisonous. They could present themselves as practical men solving a liquidity problem. They had money. Others needed it. Terms were arranged. Collateral was taken. Procedure was followed. As usual, the cleanest systems are the ones where nobody needs to admit what is happening aloud. The erasure comes through moral simplification. Later readings often turn Nehemiah into a leadership example. Decisive governor confronts injustice, makes people promise reform, continues the work. That is true enough. But beneath the leadership lesson sits the harsher diagnosis. A society with sacred debt release laws still reproduced debt bondage when imperial extraction and local inequality pressed hard enough. The sermon version prefers character. The text preserves structure. The Orthodox explanation says ancient debt slavery was a private matter between borrower and lender. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the math completely breaks down. Nehemiah's crisis is not private finance. It is famine pushing families toward loans, imperial taxation forcing cash needs, local elites supplying credit, land being mortgaged, and children being absorbed into bondage. Calling that a private transaction is like calling a flood a series of personal hydration events. Still, the mainstream view deserves its narrow defense. Borrowing may have been necessary. Lenders may have believed they were preserving economic order. Tax obligations to the empire were real. Food shortages were real. Social systems under pressure often turn ugly without anyone needing to wake up as a cartoon villain. But that defense only goes so far. Because when survival forces one party to borrow and law allows the other party to take children, the word agreement begins to rot from the inside. Several cautious readings remain possible. One is that Nehemiah confronted a specific emergency caused by famine and Persian taxation rather than a constant condition. Another is that the biblical release traditions represent an ideal repeatedly invoked because actual practice kept failing. A third is that the crisis reveals an older Near Eastern pattern adapted into Israelite covenant law. Debt release was not an isolated religious oddity, but part of a regional memory that societies had to periodically rescue themselves from creditor accumulation. The deeper possibility is more uncomfortable. Sacred law did not eliminate debt bondage because law alone cannot defeat the economic conditions that produce it. A commandment can prohibit permanent enslavement. It cannot make a failed harvest produce grain. It cannot make imperial tax vanish. It cannot stop local elites from noticing opportunity. Law can name the evil. Power decides whether the naming matters. So what happens when a community's highest ideals depend on economic arrangements that contradict them? Is a child pledged for tax still part of a sacred people? Or has the empire already rewritten the family as collateral? And if divine law had to command release every 7th year, does that mean freedom was normal? Or that bondage was expected to return on schedule? The takeaway is severe. Because it is familiar, debt becomes most dangerous when it recruits morality to disguise coercion. Everyone can claim duty, the empire claims tax, the creditor claims repayment, the debtor claims responsibility. The child, being less skilled in legal language, simply disappears into someone else's house. From Jerusalem's mortgaged children, the investigation crosses the sea to Athens, where another society famous for freedom nearly strangled before democracy could become a brand. There, stone markers stood in the soil, citizens slid toward bondage, and a poet lawgiver was asked to perform surgery on a city that had mistaken creditors for foundations. Chapter 6. Solon removes the stones, not the memory. The 6th fragment of our investigation sits in Attica, where you walk past fields marked by stones that do not merely identify land. They accuse it. The markers stand like little legal tombstones in the soil, announcing that this plot is not fully free, that someone has a claim, that the farmer working it is already partly owned by the future. Athens is not yet the polished birthplace of democracy sold in marble gift shops. It is a tense agricultural society where aristocratic creditors hold power, smallholders are sinking, and citizens can be dragged toward bondage before they ever get the chance to become legendary voters. Into this crisis steps Solon, poet, lawgiver, and emergency surgeon for a city discovering that freedom is difficult to philosophize about when your population is being collateralized. If this anomaly is verified, the official myth of Athenian democracy needs a less flattering opening scene. Before Athens became the cradle of civic reason, it nearly became a creditor plantation. The file centers on Solon's reform known as seisaktheia, the shaking off of burdens, traditionally associated with his Archon ship in 594 or 593 BCE. Ancient and modern accounts describe him canceling debts, abolishing debt slavery, and bringing back Athenians who had been sold abroad. Aristotle's Athenian constitution is a major source for the claim that loans secured on the debtor's person were prohibited. The hectameroi are associated with a disputed arrangement involving a sixth of produce. Debt markers known as horoi sit at the center of the traditional story, though scholars still debate their exact function in early 6th century Athens. One reform, one city on the edge of civil fracture, one ban on personal security for loans, one memory of citizens sold away, and a field of stones that made debt visible. The contradiction is almost rude. Democracy did not emerge from pure civic genius, public debate, and men suddenly falling in love with equality while wearing excellent sandals. It required debt emergency surgery. Before Athens could ask who should speak in the assembly, it had to ask why so many future citizens were becoming merchandise. The engineering problem was social architecture. Solon had to prevent civil conflict without completely destroying aristocratic power. The poor wanted relief. The rich wanted their claims. The city needed both sides alive enough not to burn the system down. Canceling debts and abolishing debt bondage attacked the mechanism by which economic inequality was turning into bodily domination. But Solon did not create equality. He stopped inequality from detonating. A modest achievement. Only the prevention of social collapse. The power system under threat was aristocratic land credit dominance. In a small agrarian society, land was not just a resource. It was political standing, family continuity, military capacity, and social identity. When debt allowed elite creditors to seize land or bodies, the polis itself began to deform. A citizen in debt bondage is not simply poorer, he is politically reduced. A man sold abroad is not available for civic participation. Hard to attend the assembly from another country, especially when you are property. This is the part the grand story softens. Athens is remembered for temples, drama, philosophy, and the radiant invention of public reason. Good lighting, strong branding. But one of its foundational preconditions was the removal of debt burdens that had tied people to land, creditors, and sale. The polis needed bodies back. It needed smallholders not to become dependent labor. It needed citizens who could stand upright long enough to pretend the system was based on freedom. Who feared Solon's reform? Creditors who had invested in the old arrangement. Aristocrats whose power flowed not only from birth, but from claims on land and people. To them, debt cancellation was not liberation. It was robbery wearing reform language. They had contracts, they had customs, they had expectations. Unfortunately for them, they also had a city approaching class war. The orthodox explanation says Athenian democracy was born from a noble love of freedom. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the math completely breaks down. Freedom did not descend on Athens like a clean idea from a philosophy seminar. It arrived after debt had pushed the city toward rupture. The cradle of democracy first had to stop rocking because creditors were standing on it. Sure, the Athenians loved liberty, especially after discovering that the alternative involved citizens being exported. Still, the mainstream story deserves a careful hearing. Solon's reforms were not a modern democratic revolution. He did not establish full political equality. He left class divisions intact. He balanced competing interests. He preserved property. He reorganized participation in ways still shaped by wealth. Anyone trying to turn him into a modern social reformer wearing a Bronze Age conscience should slow down. Athens remained hierarchical. The poor were relieved, not enthroned. But the narrowness of the reform makes the case stronger. Solon's achievement was not that he abolished inequality. It was that he identified one form of inequality as politically fatal: the conversion of debt into personal bondage. The city could tolerate rich and poor. It could not tolerate a system where the poor became the rich's human inventory while still expecting civic stability. Alternative readings remain cautious. The horoi may not have functioned exactly as later tradition imagined. The hectameroi may have been tenants, dependents, sharecroppers, or something more legally complex than a simple debt class. Solon's own role may have been mythologized by later Athenians who wanted democracy to have a dignified ancestor. Fine, let the debate breathe. But even if the details are contested, the memory preserved by Athens is revealing. The city remembered its political birth as tied to debt relief, the removal of burdens, the return of citizens, and the prohibition of loans secured on the body. Societies do not usually invent humiliating origin stories unless something about them refuses to disappear. The memory is the evidence. Solon removed the stones, but not the human tendency behind them. Creditors would always prefer obligation to remain sacred. Debtors would always learn that sacred obligations become less sacred when they attach to your body. States would always discover, sooner or later, that a population crushed by debt cannot serve as the foundation for freedom, armies, taxation, or legitimacy. So, what is democracy worth if its citizens can be privately unmade by debt? Can political equality survive when economic claims reach into the body before the assembly ever convenes? And if Athens needed debt abolition before democracy could become possible, why is debt relief so often treated as a threat to civilization rather than one of its preconditions? The takeaway is not romantic. Athens did not become free because Athenians were morally superior to everyone else. It became politically possible because someone interrupted a system that was converting citizens into collateral. Freedom was not born clean, it was extracted from the ledgers. From the fields of Attica, the investigation moves to Rome, where law would become harder, colder, and more theatrical. The stones disappear. The chain does not. It returns with deadlines, custody periods, market day procedures, and the uniquely Roman talent for making violence feel like paperwork with ancestors. Chapter 7. Rome's Lawful Chain. 30 days to lose your body. Number 7. You stand in early Rome, not beneath marble triumphs, but in the narrow legal shadow of a debt that has already been judged. The debtor is not running. He is not hiding in a cave outside the city muttering against civilization. He is waiting inside a system that has given him time, procedure, and the privilege of watching his own freedom expire in public. 30 days pass. Rome is patient when patience has teeth. The man is plebeian, poor enough to owe, visible enough to seize, and Roman enough to be processed according to law. His body is still technically his, but the calendar has begun dividing it into someone else's property. If this anomaly is verified, the noble story of Roman law as rational order needs a colder translation. Rome did not replace violence with law. It gave violence a schedule. The file is the 12 Tables, traditionally dated to 451 and 450 BCE, Rome's foundational written legal code. Table 3 dealt with debt procedure. An acknowledged or adjudged debtor was granted 30 days for payment. If payment did not come, he could be seized. Some traditional translations describe binding with fetters of at least 15 pounds. After 60 days in custody with market day appearances and opportunities for settlement, the debtor could be sold beyond the Tiber, and in the darker reconstructions, exposed to penalties so severe that later readers spend centuries arguing whether Rome really meant them literally. Then comes the Lex Poetilia Papiria, traditionally dated to 326 BCE, sometimes placed at 313 BCE, associated with ending nexum, the old form of debt bondage. The numbers sit there like a legal autopsy: 30 days to pay, seizure after default, 15-pound restraints in some accounts, 60 days in custody, public market procedures, sale beyond the Tiber, reform more than a century later. This is not a mob. This is not panic. This is bureaucracy discovering the body. The contradiction is procedural cruelty. Rome's system did not need to behave like a drunken raider kicking down a door. It gave notice. It used hearings. It respected sequence. It allowed time for redemption. Then, when the stages were complete, it removed freedom with the clean conscience of a clerk closing a file. The official story says Roman law created rational legal order. Fair enough. Written law limited arbitrary elite power. It made procedure visible. It restrained private vendetta by placing coercion inside public rules. Compared with random force, this was progress. A debtor could know the steps by which he would be ruined, comforting. Very Roman. The engineering here was legal architecture. Rome had to convert social hierarchy into enforceable civic form. Patrician creditors needed reliable collection. Plebeian debtors needed at least the appearance of legal protection. The city needed military manpower, internal stability, and a way to prevent debt disputes from becoming endless street violence. So Rome built procedure around coercion, not to eliminate it, to make it legitimate. That is the special genius of the 12 Tables. They did not hide violence, they domesticated it. They took the creditor's anger and gave it deadlines. They took bodily seizure and placed it inside a civic ritual. They took domination and made it Roman. The power layer is not difficult to see. Patrician creditors held economic leverage over plebeian bodies. Debt enforcement converted inequality into submission. A man who owes is not merely financially weakened. He is politically softened. He hesitates before challenging the elite. He worries about his family. He calculates every public act against private vulnerability. Debt becomes a silent magistrate sitting inside the household. Rome's problem was that plebeians were not decorative. They were soldiers, workers, fathers, voters in a developing political order. A republic cannot endlessly humiliate the bodies it expects to fight its wars. This is the ancient state's recurring inconvenience. The poor are extremely useful alive, mobilized, and not permanently chained to creditors. The story of Gaius Publilius, preserved in later Roman memory through Livy's account, dramatizes the pressure point. A young debtor or guarantor allegedly suffered abuse at the hands of Lucius Papirius, provoking outrage and reform. Whether the episode is exact history, moralized memory, or political theater, its function is clear. Rome remembered debt bondage not as a technical clause, but as a threat capable of humiliating citizens so deeply that the system itself had to retreat. The Lex Patilia Papiria, associated with ending Nexum, becomes the reform marker. Not because elites suddenly discovered a hidden organ called compassion, because plebeian unrest, military necessity, and civic stability made bodily debt enforcement too expensive. When domination begins endangering recruitment, even aristocrats can develop principles. The orthodox explanation says Rome's debt laws were harsh, but part of a developing legal order that gradually improved. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the math completely breaks down. Table 3 is what happens when a spreadsheet develops handcuffs. Rational, yes. Comforting, no. The law did not ask whether the debtor's ruin came from crop failure, war service, tax burdens, family crisis, or predatory lending. It asked whether the claim stood. Once the claim stood, the body became reachable. A society that can weigh fetters has already made philosophy unnecessary. Still, the mainstream view has its limited defense. Roman law did evolve. Public procedure could reduce arbitrary creditor violence. Later reform did restrict or abolish certain forms of bodily debt bondage. The movement from private seizure toward more regulated obligations was not meaningless. It mattered. For real debtors, any limit on creditor power could mean survival. But limits are not innocence. A legal system that first allows the chain, then congratulates itself for shortening it, has not escaped the problem. It has merely discovered public relations. Several cautious hypotheses fit the evidence. The first is that Rome's early debt procedure preserved older customary practices by writing them into civic law. The second is that the harshness of Table 3 reflects elite anxiety. Creditors wanted visible guarantees in a society where wealth, land, and political power were intensely contested. The third is that later reform came from pressure below, as plebeian resistance forced the state to choose between protecting creditor absolutism and preserving the republic's human infrastructure. The deeper hypothesis is the most uncomfortable. Roman law did not become great because it was gentle. It became great because it was capable of organizing force so precisely that later civilizations mistook precision for justice. A chain with a court date is still a chain. It just has better documentation. So when does legal procedure become laundering for coercion? If every step is public, witnessed, and properly timed, does that make the final loss of freedom more just, or merely more impressive? And what kind of republic builds citizenship on the bodies of men who can be seized for debt, then asks those same men to die for the public good? The takeaway is cold because Rome is so familiar. It shows that law can be both a shield and a weapon, sometimes in the same clause. Written rules can restrain power, but they can also teach power to walk upright, speak calmly, and carry a calendar. From Rome's lawful chain, the investigation moves into the empire's final transformation. The old debt bond would not need to survive in its original form. It had learned enough. Later power would discover a cleaner method. Stop calling the man a debtor slave, register him to the estate, attach his taxes to the soil, restrict his movement, and preserve the word free for ceremonial purposes. Chapter 8. The Last Transformation. From Debtor to Serf. The eighth and final case file opens on a late Roman estate where you stand beside a farmer who is legally free and practically unable to leave. No chain circles his ankle. No creditor drags him through the market. No tablet says his wife and children must serve 3 years in someone else's household. The language has improved. This is important. Empires enjoy improving language when conditions become embarrassing. The man is a colonus, tied to land through tax registration, estate obligation, and imperial necessity. He works soil that feeds the fiscal system. Behind him stand landowners who need labor, tax collectors who need predictability, and emperors trying to hold together a vast machine with fewer choices than the monuments suggest. If this anomaly is verified, the comforting story of ancient progress from slavery toward freedom becomes unstable. The chain did not simply disappear, it changed departments. The file moves into the late Roman Empire. Diocletian began his reign in 284 CE amid sweeping fiscal and administrative reforms designed to stabilize an empire under pressure. In the centuries that followed, many agricultural workers known as colony became legally attached to estates through taxation, status, and obligation. A law of 332 CE under Constantine is often connected with recalling colony to private lands and reinforcing their attachment to estates. These people could be formally free, yet restricted in migration, service, fiscal identity, and practical independence. Scholarship often treats the colonate as a status between full freedom and slavery, connected to tax registration, estate control, and rural labor dependence. The data cluster is cold. 284 CE, imperial fiscal reform, 332 CE, legal reinforcement under Constantine, free status, restricted mobility, private estates, public taxes, labor dependence without the old vocabulary of enslavement. The contradiction is elegant enough to be dangerous. Do not call the man a slave. Register him to the land. Attach his tax identity to the estate. Limit his movement. Preserve the word free for ceremonial use. The official story says the ancient world gradually moved away from slavery toward more complex medieval forms of dependence. This is not false, it is just too clean. Sometimes history does not march from bondage to liberty. Sometimes it walks from bondage to legally ambiguous dependency with better paperwork. The cage got renamed. The tenant probably called it Tuesday. The engineering problem facing the late Roman state was survival. Empires require revenue, and revenue requires people who can be found. A mobile rural population is difficult to tax. A collapsing currency, military pressure, administrative strain, and local instability all push the state toward fixation. Fix prices, fix occupations, fix taxpayers, fix labor to land. The empire did not need every worker to be a slave in the old sense. It needed them to be locatable, accessible, and difficult to remove from the fiscal grid. That is the genius of the colonate. It transformed older forms of personal dependency into an administrative condition. Debt bondage had once allowed creditors to reach the body through default. The late empire reached the body through registration. Your obligation no longer needed to begin with a loan. It could begin with where you were listed. This was not simply private oppression, it was a convergence. The landowner wanted stable labor, the tax collector wanted stable assessment, the imperial state wanted predictable revenue. The worker wanted survival, which history has often treated as an exploitable preference. Together, these needs formed a machine in which freedom could remain legally intact while practical exit was quietly dismantled. Who feared mobility? Almost everyone above the farmer. Landowners feared losing labor to flight. The state feared losing taxpayers into administrative fog. Local officials feared the collapse of quotas. The army feared unpaid supply chains. The empire feared people moving faster than the documents. A free man who cannot leave is a very useful invention. He flatters the law while serving the estate. The power layer here is broader than private credit. Earlier debt systems trapped households through loans, interest, pledges, and default. The late Roman system absorbed the logic and expanded it. Dependency no longer required a dramatic failure. It could be inherited through fiscal status. It could be attached to land. It could be enforced by the language of order, necessity, and public revenue. The creditor's chain became the tax register. The household bond became estate obligation. The debtor became the rural dependent whose freedom was technically present and practically rationed. This is how institutions mature. They stop looking brutal. They start looking necessary. The erasure works because the colonist is difficult to categorize. He is not quite enslaved. He is not fully autonomous. He is free in a sentence and trapped in a system. Historians use careful terms because careful terms are needed. But careful terms can also sedate the moral imagination. Intermediate status sounds technical. A man legally free but unable to leave the estate that defines his tax life sounds less relaxing. The orthodox explanation deserves fairness. The colonate was not identical to earlier debt slavery. Many colony had households, legal personality, and recognized status. The system varied across regions and periods. It developed gradually, not from one single sinister meeting where imperial officials gathered to abolish mobility while adjusting their robes. Late Roman society was complex, and the colonate cannot be reduced to one law or one cause. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the math completely breaks down. Because complexity does not erase coercion. A man can have legal personality and still be locked into dependence. A household can be recognized by law and still be immobilized by tax obligation. A worker can be called free and still discover that leaving is illegal, punishable, or economically impossible. The empire did not need to own him completely. It only needed to control the conditions under which he could move, work, and be counted. Several cautious hypotheses can sit beside the evidence. The first is that the colonate emerged as a fiscal technology, binding people to taxable land so the state could survive administrative crisis. The second is that large landowners benefited from imperial policy by gaining a more stable labor force under the cover of public necessity. The third is that the colonate represents not the end of debt bondage, but its mutation into status dependency, where the older logic of obligation was absorbed into law, land, and inheritance. The most disturbing hypothesis is that societies rarely abolish profitable coercion by becoming enlightened. They abolish the version that has become too visible, too unstable, or too politically costly. Then they rebuild the function under another name. So what is freedom if the law declares it while the tax system denies movement? When the chain becomes a registration category, does bondage end or become harder to see? And if the final transformation of ancient debt was not slavery but immobilized dependency, how many later systems of free labor should be reread with less confidence? The takeaway is not that every colonist was a slave in disguise. That would be too crude. The takeaway is sharper. Power does not always need ownership when it can secure attachment. It does not always need chains when it has records. It does not always need to buy the body when it can bind the life around it. From Sumerian release cones to barley loans, Babylonian timers, royal resets, mortgaged children, Athenian stones, Roman chains, and late imperial tax registers, the pattern has finally completed its circle. Debt began as a claim. Then it became labor, then family, then land, then law, then status. The archive does not show a straight march toward freedom. It shows power learning to speak more softly. Outro, the paperwork of the chain. If you have followed the archive this far, you are not here for the comfortable version of history. You are here because the straight line looks suspicious. Because when textbooks say civilization advanced from chaos into law, you notice the missing footnote. Law can protect the weak, but it can also teach extraction how to dress properly. The case files do not prove that every ancient debt was evil, every creditor predatory, or every ruler secretly humanitarian. That would be too simple, and history rarely rewards simplicity unless it is being sold to children. Credit helped people survive bad seasons. Law restrained arbitrary violence. Reform sometimes mattered. A debtor released in the fourth year was still released. A stone removed from an Athenian field still changed a life. But the larger pattern is colder. Ancient societies learned very early that debt could do what armies did, but with less noise. It could take land without conquest, labor without purchase, children without kidnapping, and obedience without a visible chain. Then, whenever the system became too obvious or too destructive, power did not always abolish the logic. It adjusted the format. Release cones, interest tablets, mercy clauses, royal cancellations, sacred sabbaticals, removed stones, Roman deadlines, estate registers, different materials. Same question. Who gets to convert another person's emergency into a permanent claim? The honest answer is that civilization did not move cleanly from bondage to freedom. It moved through cycles of capture and correction. The poor borrowed because life was unstable. Creditors collected because law allowed it. Kings intervened when private claims threatened public control. Religious systems commanded release when brotherhood began resembling asset seizure. Republics reformed when citizens became too valuable to chain openly. Empires renamed immobility as administration. The chain did not vanish. It became more literate. That is the final crack in the official timeline. Freedom was never merely invented once, then handed down like a polished statue. It had to be recreated again and again against systems that discovered new ways to bind people while calling the result order. And if you saw that pattern before the ending, that is why you made it this far. You are wired to distrust clean narratives when the evidence smells like clay, tax rolls, and polite coercion. Subscribe to Minimal Histories and defend your theory in the comments. Was ancient debt a necessary tool that became abusive, or was it always a quiet technology of control? The archive does not give us comfort. It gives us a warning. Every civilization writes its values in law, but it writes its real priorities in what it is willing to enforce against the desperate.